Hi guys! This week we were talking about White Sargasso Sea, so I thought I'd make another video and see how uh, that works out. I have a lot to talk about for this week. I feel like there were uh, a lot of topics in this book. This is the this is the book I'm going to be doing my final paper on. So of course I'm super interested, and especially after talking to Jen a little more in depth about my paper, which is a big help. So if you're struggling with writing that final paper, make an appointment with Jen because it really does help. Um, so let's get started. Um, I wanted to discuss the novel as a, as a revision of traditional representations of the female classic British literature, while exploring the interrogation of troops of the female as other. Troops are, I actually had to look it up because I was like, I don't understand the meaning of that in that context. And the best I could come up with is essentially cliches, which would make sense because the stereotypical female as other, or the shunned thing in classic British literature. So I feel like that's a really good dynamic to think about when reading this book. Typically, women during this time period were always thought to be composed and really meek and mild-mannered, much like the female characters of Jane Eyre. You know, everyone in that book, even though it was like 15 years later, it was still that sort of atmosphere. Everyone was very composed, quiet. They only spoke when they were spoken to, and that sort of thing. But in Wide Sargasso Sea, we see a completely different concept. You know, readers are exposed to essentially wild women who can't be tamed. They aren't tamed by nuns, and they aren't tamed by their men. You know, Antoinette and her mother, they both seek passion, and they both seek freedom. I found this particularly delicious quote that I thought was brilliant, and it's from this book that I happen to have for my psych days. It's called The Second Sex, and I love it. The author, she refers to the second sex as a different concept, and I'll tie this back around. It's not off topic. She said that it's an example of the female as the other. She says that she writes that these women that women brilliantly demonstrate that it is not women's inferiority that has determined their historical insignificance. It is their historical insignificance that has doomed them to inferiority. And essentially, that is what singles out the female as other, especially during that time period. And what I mean by that is there's nothing extraordinary about these women. If you don't single yourself out, then there's nothing amazing about you that makes you not the other. You can't be like a man, you can't be powerful, you can't be amazing, you're that other thing. And so that's one of the topics that I wanted to really hit on the examples that we're given in Why Sargasso Sea are Antoinette's really her insecurity about her marriage, her impending marriage. You know, to begin with, before she even marries Rochester, she says, "I'm afraid of what may happen." You know, she's afraid that she's going to lose part of herself. You know, she's not worried about, oh, well, what if I go crazy? That's not what she's concerned about, because she's not crazy. She's afraid that she's going to lose what makes her Antoinette. She's going to be insignificant, just like every other woman during that period. She's going to lose her extraordinary ability, what makes her wonderful. And this continues. Her insecurities continue. She says later that, but if one day you didn't wish it, regarding her happiness, but if one day you didn't wish it, what should I do then? Suppose you took this happiness away when I wasn't looking. Like, she's finally happy, but she's afraid at any minute that Rochester will remove this happiness away from her. And she's just gonna completely be insecure about it, I guess. And she continues to say, "I'm not used to happiness, and it makes me afraid." So, going back to, I'm afraid of what may happen, this is what she was afraid of, what would happen. You know, she made herself vulnerable. She made herself insecure. She exposed her heart to a man, and that made her the other, because it made her emotional. It made her give up that independent part of her, and which is what she was terrified of. And now she is extremely dependent upon him for everything, for her happiness, and then ultimately for her life, because she goes on to say that if I could die now when I am happy, would you do that? You wouldn't have to kill me. Say die, and I will die. Like, I'm so dependent upon on my happiness, and dependent on you for that happiness, that all you'd have to do is say, die, and I would die right now. Like, okay. I hate that. Like, it makes me heartbroken for Antoinette in the book, because she does give up so much of her independence, being the other. It is truly heartbreaking. I have to say that I probably got way too much into this book, because I was sitting there the whole time reading it like, what is this? No. No, 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 no. Oh man, he sucks. The whole time. Which really is conflicting for me, because Jane Eyre is my favorite book of all time. And, you know, you're pulling for Jane and Rochester, and in this book, you hate his guts. And you're thinking, oh, poor Antoinette, what did he do to her? I'm a very torn soul right now. Back to my discussion. Another thing that I wanted to discuss, this also ties into my paper, is part of what makes her the other. Why people call Antoinette crazy. Why she was ultimately exiled numerous times. First by, with her mother. She was exiled because her father was drunk, and, they were former slave owners. So they were exiled for that. And then she was exiled by the nuns, or with the nuns by her stepfather. And then she was exiled again with Rochester, and then exiled ultimately in England because of Rochester. He locks her in a room. And so they treat her as if she's crazy because she thinks a little differently. And, her behavior, her unique behavior, I say unique behavior because it's not normal, it's an other behavior. It's not ordinary. But then we're all a little different, aren't we? We don't all do things the same way. I remember in school getting called names because I had glasses. I still wear glasses. And because she does things differently, she gets called Marionette Antoinette. I used to get called Four Eyes, which is really an unoriginal nickname if you think about it. Like, because she is different from other people, she is treated like she's absolutely insane. And it's kind of the same way in Lessing's novel, The Grass is Singing, with Mary. She did things a little differently. She saw things a little differently than others did, and she people treated her like she was crazy. Now, in the end, I do think she kind of went a little crazy, but good Lord, give the woman some ceiling fans, maybe she wouldn't have turned out so crazy. She begins to act crazed and odd, according to societal standards. Fraternizing with the houseboy was certainly frowned upon during that time, but, Mary was able to justify that situation. She said, he has so little to do, he must earn his money. That's all it was to her. It wasn't about, like, oh yeah, you're the houseboy, come undress me. It had nothing to do with race. It had nothing to do with putting him in his place. It had nothing to do with that at all. And it was strictly about, I'm trying to find something for him to do. She just thought about things differently. Just like Antoinette. She tried to poison Rochester. It wasn't about that. She felt like she was insecure about her marriage and felt like her husband was losing interest in her. So she goes to Christophine and says, make him love me again. And so she, gives her something to put in his drink to make him love her. And then it's like, no one else would do that. No one rational. I wouldn't do that. But I don't see things the way that Antoinette does. I'm not as insecure as Antoinette is. So, when it comes down to it, it's just we all think differently. And I feel like because she was a woman, and because she wasn't a white person, she was automatically slapped with that mark of, oh, she's insane. I remember when I first started college, my very first psychology class, the very first thing we were taught was, you're gonna find out that it's always the women that are crazy. throughout history, we'll learn that it's always the women that are crazy. And they originally used to blame it on wandering uteruses. So the majority of asylums were filled with women. And their files said wandering uteruses. So maybe Antoinette just had a wandering uterus. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the cognitive differences? What are your thoughts on them just seeing things differently and not really being the other person, just being a unique individual that thinks outside of the box? Does anyone else see it that way? And maybe it's just my perspective. Maybe it is me thinking outside of the box. Maybe I'm the other female. I don't know. Maybe I have a wandering uterus. Maybe that's it. Let me know what you guys think. I'm interested to get some feedback on this, because, like I said, this was a really interesting book for me, and I would really love to know what you think.